Lightning cracked through his stare, a silent tempest churning beneath the calm that night when darkness cloaked the house. His knuckles brushed my shoulder, too deliberate, too alive. I felt the jolt, the rush, the razor-thin boundary taunting me, daring me to step across into the unknown. At 64, he unraveled like a wire snapping under strain, every flicker of my presence shredding his composure. One glance, one breath, and the room erupted into a storm of unspoken havoc. What he rasped next splintered my defenses, and you won't believe the labyrinth that plunged us into. My name's Quinn, 28 years old, tethered to a weathered craftsman home in Burlington, Vermont, alongside my mom and my stepdad, Garrett. He's 64, a grizzled ex-logger turned hardware store owner, a man who commands every room with a steely, no-frills edge. Mom hitched herself to him 9 years ago after Dad vanished into the ether, and I never spared Garrett much thought beyond his handyman fixes or his gruff nods over breakfast, nothing worth a second glance. But last autumn, after I slunk back home from a wrecked graphic design gig in Boston, I started catching something off-kilter in how his eyes tracked me, like a predator sizing up prey he hadn't meant to hunt. It wasn't blatant at first, just these fleeting ticks when his gaze would snag on me, lingering past the point of casual, but it swelled into a current I couldn't shrug off. It kicked off with small beats, like when I'd stumble downstairs in the morning, still in my sleep cami and leggings, rummaging for tea before diving into freelance pitches. Garrett would be there, hunched over the kitchen island with his ledger, and I'd spot him peering up from his numbers, following me as I shuffled between the kettle and the sink, steam curling around my fingers. He'd jerk his eyes back to his work fast, muttering about inventory, but the pattern stuck, sharpening when Mom wasn't around. She clocks long hours at the library, out before the sun rises and back after it sets, leaving me and Garrett to haunt the house alone. I chopped it up to boredom or my own jumpy nerves at first, but then one crisp Saturday in September, the air shifted in a way I couldn't dodge. Mom was pulling an extra shift to cover a colleague's absence, and I was stuck with Garrett, sorting through a mess of old camping gear in the attic, something I'd promised her I'd organize before winter hit. I wore a threadbare hoodie and jeans, dust clinging to my skin as I wrestled with tangled sleeping bags, figuring Garrett was downstairs in his den, tallying receipts or tinkering with a busted chainsaw. I didn't hear him climb the stairs, but suddenly there he was, framed in the attic hatch, clutching a thermos of coffee, watching me wrestle a lantern free from a box of moth-eaten tarps. I looked up, brushing hair from my eyes, and tossed him a quick grin, expecting him to lob the thermos my way and retreat. Instead, he climbed up, boots thudding on the creaky floorboards, and stopped a few feet off, his eyes roaming over me, my arms smudged with grime, my legs braced against a trunk, the way my hoodie rode up from the effort. I felt peeled open, not by the attic's chill, but by how he studied me, like he'd stumbled on something he wasn't meant to want. After a pause, he handed me the coffee and said, "You're turning my head into a damn mess up here," his voice low and gravelly, carrying a weight that hinted at more than he'd planned to spill. I took the thermos, stammering a thanks, trying to laugh it off by saying I'd be done soon and out of his space, but as he turned to head down, I caught this flash in his expression, something jagged, something hungry, like he was battling an urge he couldn't name. That's when it hit me like a freight train. Garrett wasn't just stealing glances anymore. He was staring at me in a way no stepdad should, and I didn't know whether to run or lean into the pull. To you reading this, I'll lay it bare. I didn't summon this, didn't clock it creeping in, but once I caught that look, I knew the house was tilting into a territory I couldn't unnap. That night, I kept spinning it over, how he'd stood there, how his words sank into me, how his eyes gripped me too long. I didn't spill it to Mom when she trudged in, because it felt too shaky to voice. What could I say, that her husband eyeballed me in the attic? It sounded hollow, and nothing hard had happened, but it wasn't nothing. It was the spark of something I couldn't unsee, and a piece of me itched to see what might ignite next. After that attic moment, things with Garrett didn't slide back to normal like I'd prayed they would. We still rattled around this Burlington house with Mom, and on the surface, the days ticked by, her vanishing to the library at dawn, him shuffling to his store or the den, me hunched over my laptop chasing gigs. But underneath, this tension coiled tighter, a quiet hum that buzzed between us, growing louder every time our paths crossed. I started noticing how he'd carve out excuses to drift near me, even when it defied logic, nothing loud, just these small pivots in his routine that kept us brushing too close too often. One foggy morning a week later, I was in the kitchen brewing oatmeal, still in my flannel pajama pants and a loose tank, when Garrett ambled down earlier than his usual. Typically, he'd linger upstairs until Mom was gone. He poured himself a mug of black coffee, propped himself against the counter, and watched me stir the pot, his gaze steady and deliberate as I sprinkled cinnamon over the bubbling oats. He didn't say much, just asked if I'd slept through the storm last night, but his tone had this undercurrent, like he was probing for more than a yes or no. I nodded, keeping it short, saying the thunder barely nudged me awake, expecting him to grab his mug and go, but he stayed, sipping slow, his eyes trailing me as I scooped breakfast into a bowl and slid onto a stool. It wasn't a big deal by itself, just him standing there, but it weighed heavier than it should have, because when I flicked my eyes up, our gazes locked, and he didn't flinch away like before. He held it, then said, "You're up earlier than I figured today," before finally turning to leave. It was a throwaway line, but it stuck with me all morning, the way it felt measured, like he'd rehearsed it. Then, a few days later, I was sprawled in the living room sorting mail, Mom at work again, the TV muttering some weather report while I ripped open bills and junk flyers. Garrett rolled in from the store sooner than I'd clocked, his work jacket still zipped, and I assumed he'd barrel straight to the den like always, but he paused in the archway, watching me stack envelopes into messy piles. He asked if I wanted help, which threw me because he'd never offered before, and I said no. I was nearly done, just killing time. He nodded but didn't budge, just stood there, eyes on me as I folded a coupon sheet, and I kept going, pretending I didn't feel his stare boring into me. After a minute, he said, "You've got a knack for keeping chaos in line," his voice carrying this thread of something deeper, like he wasn't just talking about the mail. I mumbled a thanks, eyes glued to the papers, waiting for him to peel off, but he lingered, then glanced back once more before climbing the stairs, leaving me hyper-aware of every creak in the floorboards. By late September, it was a near-daily dance, him finding reasons to hover, to watch, to drop lines that teetered on the edge of too much but stayed vague enough to sidestep trouble. I didn't tell Mom, because it still felt too thin to call out, and part of me wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. To you reading this, I'll level with you. I wasn't egging him on, not yet, but I wasn't slamming the brakes either. I could have shut it down, told him to cut the crap, but instead I let it simmer, curious how far he'd push this thread we were tugging. By October's start, the pull between Garrett and me had hardened into something I couldn't ignore anymore. Mom still ghosted out to the library before dawn, staggering home wiped after dark, leaving the house a quiet arena for us to circle each other. Those moments when he'd linger piled up, and I wasn't imagining it now. His focus was intentional, and I was starting to see how much he couldn't bury it. One evening, I was in the basement digging through crates of Mom's old vinyls she'd asked me to sort, the air cool and musty, wearing a long-sleeve tee and joggers, nothing fancy, just cozy for the dusty job. Garrett had been upstairs in his den, or so I thought, grinding through paperwork for a supplier, but I didn't hear his boots on the stairs until he was there, leaning against the railing, watching me stack records by genre. I jolted, glancing up, and asked what he wanted, figuring he'd come for a tool or a box, but he said he was just checking if I needed a hand, though he didn't move to help, just stood there, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes pinned on me as I bent to lift a crate of jazz LPs. I told him I was good, I'd wrap up soon, but he stepped closer anyway, near enough that I caught the faint whiff of pine and motor oil on his flannel, leftovers from his day. He didn't speak for a second, just watched me shuffle the records, then said, "You make everything look like it's no sweat at all," his voice deep and even, not sounding like a tossed-off compliment. I straightened, dusting my hands on my pants, and said it was just grunt work, nothing special, but he didn't let it go. He took another step, closing the gap, and said, "I see a hell of a lot more than you think I do." It wasn't slippery anymore, it was straight up, hanging thick between us, and I didn't know how to dodge it, so I just nodded and turned back to the crates, hoping he'd leave. He didn't. He stayed, watching me finish, and when I hauled a box upstairs, he trailed me, a few steps behind, his presence a shadow I couldn't shake. Another time, days later, I was in the kitchen late, reheating chili after a marathon of portfolio tweaks. Mom asleep upstairs, the house hushed except for the microwave's drone. Garrett came down in his sweatshirt and jeans, claiming he couldn't sleep and needed water, and I figured he'd grab a glass and bounce, but he leaned against the counter instead, watching me pull my bowl out and slump at the table. He asked how my day went, and I gave him a quick rundown, rejections, revisions, the usual, keeping it light, but his eyes didn't leave me, not once. When I stood to rinse my bowl, he shifted closer, reaching past me to refill his glass at the sink, his sleeve grazing my arm, not accidental, and he stayed there, too close while I scrubbed, his silence louder than words. I finished, dried my hands, and said I was crashing, and he murmured, "Night, Quinn," in this low, heavy way that stuck to me as I bolted upstairs, feeling his stare chase me the whole way. To you reading this, here's the raw truth. I knew it was veering off the rails, but I didn't stop it. I could have told him to back off, could have ratted him out to Mom, but I didn't. Part of me was poking at it, testing how far he'd stretch, because every time he edged closer, it felt less like a fluke and more like a fuse burning down. By mid-October, the space between Garrett and me had shrunk to a thread, undeniable even if we never named it, and Mom still vanished to the library most days, leaving us to fill the house, and Garrett's excuses to orbit me were wearing thin. I wasn't blind anymore, his looks, his hovering, the way he'd fish for reasons to talk, and I wasn't just letting it roll either. I started nudging back, testing him, because part of me liked how it felt when his focus locked onto me like a spotlight. One afternoon, I was in the living room, sprawled on the sectional with my laptop, trawling job boards while a podcast droned about design trends, when Garrett rolled in from the store, his parka still on, and instead of heading to the den, he sank into the armchair across from me. I glanced up, catching his eyes already on me, and instead of ducking away, I held it, then smirked and said, "Rough haul out there today?" He nodded, scrubbing a hand over his stubble, and said, "Nothing I can't wrangle, but it's better in here with you around." His voice had this heft, like he wasn't just talking about the house, and I shifted, stretching so my sweater hitched up, flashing a sliver of skin above my jeans, not planned, but I saw his gaze dip, then snap back to my face, and I didn't cover it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and asked what I was chasing online, and I told him about a pitch that tanked, keeping it breezy, and he said, "They're blind if they can't see what you've got," which could have been nothing, but the slow, deliberate way he said it made it land different. I laughed, tilting my head, and said, "Guess I'll wait for someone who gets it," and his eyes tightened, and he said, "Oh, someone's getting it, trust me." That kind of ping-pong started spiking, like one morning in the kitchen when I was pouring juice, still in a crop top and shorts, hair a wreck from sleep, and Garrett strolled in, still in his plaid pajama bottoms, catching me as I stretched for a glass. I turned, leaning against the counter, juice in hand, and said, "You're up early for a change," and he stepped closer, snagging a mug from the shelf beside me, his arm brushing mine, and said, "Couldn't miss the scenery down here." I didn't flinch, just arched a brow and said, "Beats the frost outside, huh?" And he grinned, sharp and real, and said, "By a damn mile." Then there was the evening I was tinkering with a wobbly chair in my room, just tightening bolts Mom had griped about, kneeling with a wrench when Garrett tapped the doorframe and leaned in, asking if I needed a hand. I said I was fine, but he crouched beside me anyway, steadying the chair, his fingers inches from mine, and I could feel his eyes on me as I twisted the last bolt. I sat back, wiping sweat off my brow, and said, "Guess I'm not a total lost cause," and he looked at me, steady, and said, "Never thought you were opposite, if anything." I met his gaze, grinning, and said, "Good to know I've got your backing," and he stood slow, offering a hand, and said, "You've got more than that, Quinn." It wasn't just talk, his moves screamed louder. One night, I was out front raking leaves in the twilight, earbuds in, wearing a jacket and leggings, when Garrett emerged with a rake, saying Mom wanted the yard prepped for a frost. I popped an earbud out and said, "Didn't peg you for yard duty tonight," and he started raking beside me, close enough our piles tangled, and said, "Thought you might want the company, beats working solo." We raked in quiet, but I'd catch him glancing, and once, bending to bag leaves, I looked up to see him staring, rake frozen mid-swing. I straightened, smirking, and said, "Slacking already," and he stepped closer, voice dipping, and said, "Hard to keep my head on with you out here bending over like that." To you reading this, I'll own it. I knew what I was doing by then. I wasn't just letting him flirt. I was tossing it back, pushing the line because it lit me up when he zeroed in, and I could have stopped it, but I didn't. Every time he upped the ante, I matched it, and it was barreling towards something we couldn't duck. By November, the thread between Garrett and me wasn't just frayed, it was damn near snapped. Mom's library grind kept her oblivious, and the house became our playground, the flirting shedding its mask, turning into a tightrope we both walked, testing each other with every step and stare. I didn't know where it was headed, but I wasn't pulling the ripcord, and neither was he. One Saturday afternoon, I was in the garage, futzing with an old radio I dug out of a junk pile, something to keep my hands busy while I mulled next moves, wearing a cropped tee and cargos, grease streaking my arms as I fiddled with the dial. Garrett rolled in, supposedly to grab a wrench, but he stopped cold when he saw me, leaning against the workbench, arms crossed, eyes raking over me slow and shameless. I looked up, wiping my hands on a rag, and said, "What, you here to oversee the chaos now?" And he smirked, stepping closer, and said, "Just making sure you don't break that thing, or me, while you're at it." I stood, tossing the rag aside, leaning against the radio to mirror him, and his gaze slid over me, blatant, and I didn't shy away. I tilted my head and said, "Think I'm the one breaking you down, huh?" He shifted, closing the space just enough I could feel the air thicken, and said, "You're doing a hell of a job at it, I'll give you that." I laughed, light but sharp, and said, "Guess you'll have to toughen up then," and he didn't retreat, just held my eyes and said, "Not sure I want to toughen up around you." Later that week, I was in the kitchen baking scones out of sheer restlessness, flour dusting the counter, wearing a Henley and tights, sleeves shoved up as I kneaded dough, when Garrett wandered in, claiming the smell dragged him down. He parked at the table, watching me shape the batch, and I glanced over my shoulder and said, "You just gonna sit there and gawk, or what?" He leaned back, hands laced behind his head, and said, "Got the best view in the house, why move an inch?" I scooped dough onto a tray, feeling his stare cling to me, and said, "You could at least pitch in, you know," and he rose slow, stepping right behind me, reaching for a spatula, his chest close enough I could feel the heat radiating off him. When he handed it over, his fingers grazed mine, lingering, and I didn't pull back, just kept kneading and said, "You're awful at helping, Garrett." He stayed put, voice dropping, and said, "I'm damn good at watching you, though," and I turned my head a fraction, our faces brushing near, and said, "Careful, you might get hooked on the show," and he didn't blink, just said, "Too late, I'm already hooked solid." We held there, the air crackling, before I turned back to the dough, but it was charged, heavy. Then there was the night I was in the living room, curled under a quilt, scrolling my phone after Mom crashed, when Garrett came down in his thermal and jeans, saying sleep wouldn't stick again, and sat on the couch's far end, closer than he needed to be. He asked what I was eyeballing, and I flashed him a dumb video, and he chuckled, shifting so his knee nudged mine under the quilt. I didn't budge, just said, "You're crowding my turf now," and he stretched his arm along the backrest, fingers brushing my hair, and said, "Plenty of room if you're good with sharing it." I turned to face him, tugging the quilt tighter, and said, "You're really testing it tonight, aren't you?" And his eyes locked on mine, steady, and he said, "You're not telling me to quit, Quinn." I held his stare, letting the quiet stretch, then said, "Maybe I'm just seeing how far you'll run with it," and he leaned in a hair, voice low, and said, "Keep daring me, and you'll find out soon enough." I didn't flinch, just smirked and said, "Guess we'll see who blinks first," and he stayed close till I finally peeled off to bed, his eyes trailing me every step. To you reading this, here's where it stood. We were teetering on a cliff, and I wasn't playing dumb anymore. I loved how he watched me, how he pushed, and I was shoving back just as hard. It wasn't innocent, it was a magnet dragging us in, and it was only a matter of time before it tipped into something we couldn't claw back from. By late November, the tension between Garrett and me had thickened into a fog neither of us could cut through. Mom still clocked her library hours, blind to the shift, and every look, every word, every near touch between us sparked like flint on steel. We'd been circling, flirting, prodding for weeks, and it was barreling toward a breaking point we couldn't sidestep. That night, it all boiled over, stretching taut and slow until it stopped just shy of the plunge. It was a frigid Friday, snow dusting the windows, with Mom pulling a rare overnight at the library to prep for a grant deadline. I was in the living room, antsy, flipping through streaming shows with a throw over my legs, wearing a baggy pullover and shorts after a hot shower, just trying to unwind. Garrett came downstairs around 10, in his usual jeans and a faded Henley, saying he'd wrapped some orders and couldn't sleep, and instead of claiming the armchair, he dropped onto the couch beside me, close enough our hips grazed under the throw. I shot him a look, corking a brow, and said, "Getting cozy with your spot tonight, huh?" And he draped his arm along the backrest, fingers hovering near my neck, and said, "Thought I'd roll the dice, see if you kick me off." I didn't shift away, just tugged the throw down a bit, baring my legs, and said, "Guess I'll let it ride for now," and his eyes dipped, lingering on the exposed skin, then flicked back to my face, and he said, "You're making it real tough to keep my hands to myself, Quinn." His voice rougher, rawer than usual, sending a shiver down my spine. I turned to him, pulling one knee up so it brushed his thigh, and said, "Maybe I'm not asking you to play nice tonight," and he leaned closer, his hand shifting so his knuckles skimmed my shoulder, not gripping, but close enough I felt the heat pulsing off him. He said, "You've been twisting me up for weeks, don't pretend you haven't clocked it," and I tilted my head, letting my hair spill over one side, and said, "Takes two to wind this tight, Garrett." His jaw clenched, and he slid his fingers along the hem of my pullover, grazing my collarbone, the air thickening with everything we'd stoked for months. I shifted again, pressing closer so my knee dug into his leg, and his hand dropped to the couch near my hip, thumb brushing the edge of my shorts. He said, "You've got no clue what you're stirring up, sitting there like that," and I met his eyes dead on and said, "I've got a damn good hunch, and you're not hiding it either." His breath hitched, slower, heavier, and he leaned in more, his face inches from mine, his grip tightening on the fabric. I didn't pull back, just let my hand drift to his knee, fingers resting there, feeling the tension coiling in him. He slid his hand up, tracing my jaw, stopping just under my chin, and said, "Tell me to stop, Quinn, or I'm not gonna," and I didn't speak, just held his stare, my hand inching up his thigh, his other hand finding my waist, pulling me until my chest nearly pressed his. It was there, the brink of it all, his breath hot on my cheek, his hands anchoring me, my pulse hammering in a way I couldn't deny. But then the front door jangled, Mom's keys fumbling in the lock, her shift cut short by a power glitch at the library. Garrett yanked back, bolting upright, raking a hand through his hair as I snatched the throw over my legs, and she shuffled in, yawning, asking how our night went. We both muttered something vague, eyes anywhere but each other, and to you reading this, that's where it froze, right on the edge, no lines crossed but every rule bent, so close I could still feel his heat, and I knew Garrett could too. From there, the fallout lingered like smoke we couldn't clear. Mom didn't catch the drift, too buried in her exhaustion, but Garrett and I couldn't unfeel what we'd grazed. The next morning, I was in the kitchen, cracking eggs for a scramble, still rattled, when he came down, quieter than usual, pouring coffee with his back to me. I didn't look up, just kept whisking, but I felt him there, the weight of last night hanging unspoken, and when he finally said, "Sleep okay after that," his voice was clipped, like he was testing the water. I nodded, saying, "Barely, you," and he grunted, "Same," and left it there, but the air stayed charged, a live wire we couldn't cut. Days bled into weeks, and we fell into this jagged rhythm. Mom's schedule kept her gone, and Garrett and I danced around each other, the tension ebbing but never dying. One afternoon, I was in the den, sketching logos on my tablet, when he rolled in from the store, dropping his keys on the desk, and instead of leaving, he lingered, watching me shade a curve. I glanced up and said, "What, critiquing my art now?" And he smirked, leaning against the wall, and said, "Just wondering how you focus with me in the room after everything." I held his eyes, pencil still, and said, "Takes practice, how are you holding up?" And he said, "Barely, but I'm still here," and walked out, leaving me buzzing. Another time, I was shoveling snow off the porch, bundled in a parka and gloves, when he joined me with a second shovel, saying Mom wanted it clear before she got home. We worked side by side, breath fogging in the cold, and I caught him watching me heft a load, so I stopped, leaning on my shovel, and said, "You're staring again, old habits die hard?" He paused, snow sliding off his blade, and said, "Some habits don't die, Quinn, they just wait," and went back to digging, but the words sank in, heavy and deliberate. To you reading this, here's the deal. We didn't cross that line, but we didn't bury it either. It simmered, a pulse neither of us could kill, and I didn't know if I wanted to. By December, it was a stalemate. Mom still clueless, the house still ours to navigate, and Garrett and I stuck in this push-pull we couldn't name. One night, I was in the attic again, boxing up holiday lights, when he appeared, claiming he needed an extension cord, but he stopped halfway up the ladder, watching me untangle a string. I looked down and said, "You gonna help or just spectate?" And he climbed up, crouching beside me, his knee brushing mine as he grabbed a strand, and said, "Can't help spectating, you pull me in every damn time." I smirked, twisting a bulb free, and said, "You're the one who keeps showing up, Garrett," and he said, "And you keep letting me," his voice low, eyes locked on mine. We stayed there, untangling in silence, the air thick with what we wouldn't say, and when we finished, he followed me down, his hand grazing my back as I stepped off the ladder, not a word, just a touch that lingered. To you reading this, that's the truth of it. We were locked in this orbit, a collision course we kept delaying, and every dodged crash only stoked the fire Mom didn't see. But we did, and it was only a matter of time before the match struck.